Hello, this is Scott Harris with Naturally Scott. You're here for episode 19. This is a first for us. This is a part 2. So if you haven't listened to it, maybe drop back to episode 18 and give it a listen. Scott Weidensaul is our guest, and Scott Weidensaul is our guest here. They're both standalone, so if you only listen to this one, you're fine, but it's going to be a blast. Scott is a brilliant expert at migration and a variety of different owls. He's a deep philosophical thinker, a New York Times bestselling author, and was an absolute joy for me to have on the podcast. Our normal podcasts run an hour, and Scott and I did two 90-minute ones. Not by design. I think we just enjoyed each other's company and the conversation, and I let Scott go because, man, he tells a mean story. So let's dive right into it. Episode 19. Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris, and my guest today is the brilliant and the charming Scott Weidensaul. Thanks for joining us. Significant to your life, both in passion and in science, are your banding projects. And I do want to talk about Project Snowstorm, and I do want to talk about your favorite bird, the northern saw-whet owl, and I want to hear about these. But you're going to have to share with the audience, because you shared it with me, and one of us is going to tell the story about why you started a northern saw-whet banding station. That's, I think it's important.
Yeah, thanks. All right. Full disclosure here. I was trying to impress a woman. I was dating this lovely woman from the Philadelphia area who had a 4-year-old daughter who loved animals, and I was doing a lot of hawk trapping and hawk banding in those days. I was up on the ridge 4 or 5 days a week trapping hawks, but a friend of mine who worked at Hawk Mountain, a fellow named Eric Atkinson, he and his wife had started banding saw-whets in their backyard in the valley below Hawk Mountain. And this is in the mid 1990s. And in those days, everybody knew that saw-whet owls were really rare because nobody ever sees saw-whet owls. They're super, super, super secretive. And in fact, our state wild conservation resource fund, that would raise money for non-game conservation, the saw-whet owl was the symbol of the Wild Resource Conservation Fund because they're cute and because they're rare. Well, Melanie and Eric caught like 80 of them in their backyard in Pennsylvania. That was unheard of. And so I thought this was pretty cool. And I thought, yeah, this would be fun. Maybe I can bring Beth and her daughter out one evening and it will make me look good. I'll earn some boyfriend points.
Not the craziest thing a guy
not
has
done. Not the craziest thing I've ever done. And so we went banding one night. We caught a couple of saw-whet owls. Jill, the daughter, got to hold one before they let it go. And about 6 months later, that relationship was over, but I'd gotten hooked on the owls. And so those folks, Eric and Melanie and a couple of other folks, we actually put in a small grant request to the Wild Resource Conservation Fund, whose symbol was the saw-whet owl, to buy equipment and allow us to recruit banders around the state of Pennsylvania to set up some saw-whet owl banding stations. And the project that I still oversee through an organization called the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in central Pennsylvania, a little town of Millersburg, Pennsylvania. We've been running that project since 1997. There are 3 stations. It's entirely volunteer run. Every fall from early October until about Thanksgiving, we've got folks in the woods every night that's not raining. We've banded somewhere north of 14,000 saw-whet owls at this point, and we've done a lot of, if I do say so, groundbreaking research with owls over the years. We were the first folks in the world to use light-sensitive geolocators to study owl migration. We did several years of nighttime triangulation tracking to find out how large territory these birds are using. We would find them during the daytime to study the kind of roost sites that they were picking. We did things that didn't work. Like I had this great idea that we could use a combination of forward-looking infrared cameras, which will allow you to actually see individual birds. Their warm bodies glow against the night sky. You can see them flying. You can actually distinguish between songbirds and owls and loons and ducks and whatever. And we thought, if we can identify these birds as they're flying over on the forward-looking infrared and have vertical beam radar running at the same time, that we could track that bird and look at flight speed, flight direction, altitude, things like that. It's a beautiful theory that in practice did not work because there's this area about 1,500 feet out from the radar unit where you can't see anything. It's like a bubble of high energy. So if it's closer than 1,500 feet, you can't see it on radar. But if it's further away than that, you can't really distinguish it too well on the infrared. So that cost a lot of donor bucks. We had a very kind, very generous donor who was willing to underwrite us, playing it, as he said, at the bleeding edge of science, and always forgiven. He was somebody who had made his millions in biomedical research, and he said, you can't learn anything if you're not failing, you're not learning anything. So,
well,
it's been a great
generous and wise
event, generous and wise, absolutely. And in fact, his family foundation made a further significant gift to us for using a different kind of technology, these little nanotag transmitters and automated receiver stations that have now grown into the Modus Wildlife Tracking Network increasing all across the world. And we've been husbanding that money until just the last couple of years, until this tracking network had gotten large enough at a continental scale that we can track large numbers of saw-whet owls in kind of minute-to-minute migration. And we're just wrapping that up now, almost 10 years after his passing. So there's, this really terrific legacy from Jim McAleer and the RJM Foundation.
That's fantastic. Now, you currently stand at roughly northern saw-whets 14,000.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for rubbing that one in. I appreciate that.
Again, let me throw that picture up again of me with the boreal. So I know you've said this is your favorite bird,
Mm-hmm.
But what have you learned? So you've been doing this for 30 years. You've managed to trap and band 14,000 owls, and it's part of what you've written about. But what have we learned? How is the community stronger and better for what you're doing?
So one of the things that we've learned about saw-whet owls is that they're not rare, they're just rarely seen. As I said, when we started this work, and the person who really got things rolling in the East was my good friend Dave Brinker, who's at the Department of Natural Resources in Maryland, but got his start in the 80s banding saw-whet owls in Wisconsin, where they kind of came up with this whole idea of like opening up nets at night and playing an audio lure recording of the owl's call to lure them in. Nobody thought of that before. Dave and Tom Erdman and a bunch of these other self-described cheesehead banders came up with that idea. But we've learned a lot of things. So we've learned that they're arguably one of the most common small forest raptors in North America, that they are found absolutely everywhere. I can't not tell you how many times I've had banders say, well, yeah, sure, you're going to catch them in Pennsylvania, but we're not going to catch them in Maryland. Well, I'll give you an example. My friends Bob and Martha Sargent, who got me hooked on songbird and hummingbird banding in Alabama, I kept telling them, look, I'm sure there are saw-whet owls coming down the Appalachian Mountains to Alabama. Well, you know how few saw-whet owl records there are for Alabama? Set up the net, turn on the lure, and try. And finally, I had gone down to Alabama to give a talk to Birmingham Audubon, and I was staying with Bob and Martha, and they did a lot of songbird banding, so they had songbird nets set up all the time in their backyard. I said, look, let's take the audio lure out, turn it on. You guys go to bed early, that's fine. I'll stay up late. And I did that for 2 nights, and the last night, as I was turning off the net, I heard a saw-whet vocalize. And I told them the next morning, I said, gotta open those nets tonight because you will catch a saw-whet. And I flew back home to Pennsylvania, and they opened the nets the next night, and they caught their first saw-whet owl. And I kid you not, there were people in the Alabama ornithological community who accused me of bringing one down in my luggage and releasing it down there. But it turns out saw-whets routinely migrate as far south as Alabama. So,
it also turns out that there are a large number of people that just don't like and won't accept change to what they believe is true.
Well, what do they say? Science
no
advances.
Northern saw-whets in Alabama, and if there is one, that damn Weidensaul must have brought it with him.
What do they say? Science advances one funeral at a time.
You know what? I had not heard that, but my goodness, that makes sense.
Talk to any grad student who's bucking up against an old fart advisor, and they'll tell you that one. So yeah, so the saw-whets have been really cool. So like right now, I mean, we're working with a young grad student named Aaron Kuhlman, who's doing his master's at University of Delaware, one of Jeff Bueller's grad students there. And Aaron is spearheading this big saw-whet owl tagging program through Project Owlnet, which is the larger collaboration of about 125 owl banding stations across Canada, the US, and Mexico that my friend Dave Brinker started many years ago, tagging hundreds of saw-whet owls using nanotag transmitters that are picked up by the Modus Wildlife Tracking System, using new ultra-low power, what are called flicker units, which triangulate off cell phone towers. He can give you kind of minute by minute locations on these birds. It's just, the technology is incredible. I mean, I'd love to talk a little bit about Project Snowstorm, what we're doing with snowy owls. Yeah, there we go. Which is the same sort of thing, where we're using these GPS GSM transmitters that are about the size of a matchbox, study the movement of snowy owls in the wintertime. And this is a project that started completely by accident, almost 17 years ago now, in the winter of 2013, 2014, when we had this, epically huge invasion of snowy owls coming down from the Canadian Arctic into the east.
What caused that?
Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of lemmings the previous summer up in the northern Ungava Peninsula in northern Quebec, and lots of snowy owls somehow figured out that's where the lemmings were and gathered there and had just buckets and buckets and buckets of babies. And that fall, all those snowy owls came south. And it was frustrating because it really put snowy owls on the radar for the general public. All kinds of television and radio and magazine and newspaper reports about it. And many of those reports parroted this old myth about snowy owls, that these were snowy owls whose food supply in the Arctic had disappeared and they're starving to death and they've come south looking desperately for food. And we've known for years that's not true. These big snowy owl invasions are almost always the product of a highly productive breeding season the summer before. Most of the owls coming south in those big years are juvenile owls on their first migration. They're fat and they're healthy, unless they get in trouble with people, which happens a lot, hit by cars or planes or whatever. And so I got a call. When we realized in early December of 2013, just how many owls were coming south. There were like 300 snowy owls piled up at Race Point at the southeastern tip of Newfoundland. People were counting like 75 in one sweep of their binoculars. We realized how many owls were going to be pouring into the eastern United States. And so, again, my good buddy Dave Brinker, who's been my partner in crime on a lot of owl stuff over the years, called me up and he said, listen, none of us are going to live long enough to see this thing again, something like this again. We need to mobilize the troops and get as much information and as much data out of this as we can. And so our initial thought was, well, we'll just try to recruit as many banders as possible, people with large raptor trapping experience, to go out and trap and band as many snowy owls as possible. And I hung up the phone with Dave, and about 2 hours later, I got a call from another friend of mine, a guy named Andy McGann, who was a former research tech on our Saw-whet project, who was working for a company called Cellular Tracking Technologies, founded by Mike Lanzone, who was a golden eagle biologist. He and Mike and his wife, Trish Miller, are two of the top golden eagle biologists in the country. And they started this company to build the transmitters they use to track snowy owls. And Andy said, hey, listen, we've got a couple of transmitters here that we built for somebody else, but if you can just cover our costs, $3,000 a transmitter, we would love to get these on snowy owls. I was like, great. Well, I don't have that kind of money. Also,
you should have let somebody else read your book.
Well,
have all that income flowing in.
Yeah, I guess this was long before that, but yeah, point taken. Also, you can't, I'm a bander. I can't just decide I'm going to go out and start slapping transmitters on snowy owls. You need permission for that. The bird banding lab has to sign off on a formal proposal. So I made a couple of phone calls, and actually one of the people I called was Jim McAleer, the guy that I just mentioned a short time ago, who'd been funding a lot of our Saw-whet work and had just given us this very large donation for Saw-whets. And I called him up and I said, listen, Jim, you've been generous to us. I'm not asking to go back to that well again. I'm just wondering if maybe you could direct us to, open some doors to people that might be able to fund, $6,000 or $7,000 to cover the cost of a couple of these transmitters. And Jim was this big, burly guy with a deep gravel. He said, well, the person around here I know with the most money is Mrs. McAleer. He said, tell you what, we'll make it a loan and I'll talk to her and then maybe we can make it a gift. And so we got some money from them. We got some money from somebody else who wanted then and wishes still to remain anonymous. And so we were able to get about half a dozen transmitters and start putting them on snowy owls that winter to find out where these birds were going. Because it turns out we knew at the time far more about the ecology and movement of snowy owls on the breeding grounds in the Arctic than we did about what they do when they come south and spend the winter in the southern latitudes with us. And part of the reason for that is that people always assumed that these were dead-end owls that came down here basically and were just going to starve to death. And who wants to study an owl that's going to starve to death? Well, they do just fine down here as long as they can keep away from the nasty things that people bring at them. So we got the first couple of owls tagged, and we thought, we'll start this little project. Dave Brinker, who is always thinking, said, we could try crowdfunding. And I said, no, wait, let me get this straight. So you think we should ask members of the public to give us money to play with owls? So that's what it's going to sound like to them. He said, yeah, we should try that. Well, duh. Snowy owls are one of the most charismatic animals on the planet. And so we launched a crowdfunding campaign that winter in cooperation with the Ned Smith Center in Pennsylvania, which is also, through which we do all of our Saw-whet banding, that provided the 501c3 nonprofit umbrella so that all the donations coming in are fully tax deductible for American citizens. And that first winter, we raised $36,000 in small, I'm talking $5, $10, $15 donations from all around the world, a roughly equivalent amount of money from organizations like the Wisconsin Natural Heritage Foundation, which said, we'll give you $3,000 to put a transmitter on a snowy owl in Wisconsin, because we want to find out what the snowy owls around here are doing. The Delaware Ornithological Society did that, and the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to put ones on the Delmarva Peninsula and in Pennsylvania and in Michigan. It just snowballed. And so that became Project Snowstorm. And Project Snowstorm still operates on the same model today that it did 17 seasons ago, which is everybody involved in Project Snowstorm volunteers their time. Nobody gets a stipend. Nobody gets any kind of a salary. We are funded entirely through small crowdfunded donations. Every year we run a crowdfunding campaign. We usually set a target of about $15,000. That covers all the transmitter costs. We cover the costs of our volunteer banders when they're in the field. We don't expect them to pay for their own food and lodging and fuel, but they're not making a salary off this either. In the year since we started, we have tagged 115 snowy owls in 17 states and Canadian provinces. It is now the largest snowy owl research project in the world. And we didn't plan it. It just kind of happened and has grown organically.
That seems to be a theme of your life, by the way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of my old bander friends used to say, I'd rather be lucky than good. And I've been better lucky than good.
Yeah, I've not been offered the opportunity to be both, but I would take either, by the way. You mentioned how charismatic snowy owls are, and I imagine you're familiar with or even know Denver Holt.
Oh, sure.
The Owl
Absolutely.
Research Institute. And, he's up in Barrow 3 months every year. And we were talking the other day, and that's one of the things he brought up. He said, look, there's just something about a snowy owl.
Sure.
He said, first of all, there's just something about owls. People that don't know or care about birds or care about raptors, all over the world, people know about owls, the wisdom and the glasses and the whole thing. And he said, and then among the owls, the snowy owl stands alone as the most. Now, there's other owls in the U.S. We've got 19 owls, but he does talk about the charisma of the snowy owl. And, it's a marvelous thing. And you mentioned Michigan. There's a little town there called Rowland, Rowland. I'm going up there next year. And one of the guests in the book, Christy Gallo, is from the UP in Michigan, the Upper Peninsula. And she told me off the record about this place because apparently they get large collections of snowy owls every winter in this little township. And they're easy to find. And she said, but you can't put it in the book. You can't tell anybody because we don't want crowds rushing up there. Yeah. Of course, I would respect that, but I went online to research it. Well, Rowland, Michigan has now declared themselves the snowy owl capital of the world.
I was going to say, the cat's out of the bag on that one.
Yeah, and I called Christy. I said, Christy, you know what? Guess what? I would honor my promise to you, but you've got to release me from it. They're advertising. Yeah. This is where you go to see snowies.
Well, and in fact, two of our volunteer banders are Chris Neary and Nova McKinley up at Whitefish Point, and they've tagged quite a few snowy owls up in the UP, and we've gotten some really phenomenal tracking data from those birds. I should also say that the tracking aspect is only one half of what we do at Project Snowstorm. We also have a team of wildlife veterinarians and wildlife pathologists that we've been working with from the very beginning to try to understand more about kind of the threat landscape that snowy owls face when they come south. And so for years, we've been collaborating with state and federal wildlife agencies, provincial wildlife agencies in Canada, wildlife rehabbers, to salvage as many snowy owls that don't make it as possible. Because we knew going into this, people knew very, very little about what threats snowy owls were facing when they come south. And it turns out, by far, at this point, we've necropsied, we and our partners have necropsied something like 430 plus snowy owls. Far and away, biggest danger to snowy owls, trauma. They get hit by planes, they get hit by cars, they fly into things, electrocution, the list goes on and on. But we also have been doing a lot of toxicology work. And some of the results that we're getting from that toxicology work are really, really troubling. We found that many snowy owls have significant levels of mercury in their system. We don't know if they're picking that up when they come south, but mercury is an air pollutant that precipitates out into aquatic systems. And it may well be that they're picking this pollutant up in the Arctic, because you can have pretty high levels of mercury in aquatic systems in the Arctic. We're also seeing an increasing number of snowy owls that are showing up with significant to potentially lethal levels of anticoagulant rodenticide, rat poison, in their system. And this is a problem not just for snowy owls, although because they're charismatic, they can serve as a kind of a poster child, but it's a problem for almost every single raptor out there.
So, Scott, this is a problem for almost every raptor out there, the rodenticide, and that's because they're eating the rats and mice that are dying from the poison. Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly. And the bigger issue is that rodenticides have become much, much more powerful in recent years, what are known as second-generation anticoagulants. They're secondary poisons. So you put the poison out, and the mouse or the rat eats it, and then, as is often the case, it goes outside because the anticoagulants, among other things, cause thirst, and it gets picked up by a raptor. And the rodenticide level the raptor gets may not be enough to kill it outright, but these are anticoagulants. They're blood thinners. So one of the issues here is actually sublethal effects. For example, if the raptor suffers a bad bite, let's say it's a red-tailed hawk or great horned owl, and it goes after an animal with teeth and it gets bitten, if it's got a significant level of anticoagulant in its system, it's a possibility that it just may not clot sufficiently to stop the bleeding and might bleed out. And it's, as I said, it's something that we're seeing more and more. It seems like with snowy owls, we've seen a fairly significant increase in the percentage of the owls showing up with worrisome levels of rodenticide in the 15, 16 years that Project Snowstorm's been going on. And if it's happening with snowy owls, I've got to think it's happening with other species. Snowy owls are often found in farmland areas, so they're around agricultural areas where they may be using rodenticides in orchards or around barns. They're often found in urban areas. A lot of the owls that we've tested are birds that have been injured or killed at airports, and there's a lot of rodenticide being used in places like that. We had an owl, one of our owls that was tagged at Logan Airport in Boston a few years ago, was leaving the airport at night and flying across the Charles River and feeding around a brewery on that side of the river. And of course, breweries have hops and oats and grains of all sorts. And, there were bait boxes, rodenticide bait boxes all over the place there. Now, that owl was eventually killed by a jet blast, but when we tested it, it had really high levels of rodenticide in its systems. Rodenticide hadn't killed it, but it was certainly not doing it any favors.
So 2 questions. With the rodenticide being an anticoagulant, will it kill the bird? I understand that if it has a high buildup of that and the bird gets injured or bit or attacked or something, it could bleed out. But can it kill the bird in the way that we think of just poison killing something?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. What'll happen is at high enough level, as happens with the rodent, it'll cause internal hemorrhaging and the bird will bleed to death internally.
Okay.
Now, I want to stress the single biggest problem we've had the last couple of years with snowy owls has been highly pathogenic avian influenza. Avian flu has dwarfed pretty much everything else we've seen in terms of mortality. Snowy owls, bald eagles, red-tailed hawks, great horned owls. The list goes on and on. It's not just snowy owls. We've actually been unable to test many snowy owls since about 2021, ever since this avian influenza epidemic started, simply because most of them test positive for avian influenza, and the carcasses have to be destroyed to prevent them from being a contamination issue. Avian influenza, as we're finding out, is something that can jump to humans. And so, we don't want people, scientists, veterinarians, necropsying these birds if there's a chance they could pick up avian influenza. So we're flying a little bit blind right now. And the number of snowy owls that have been dying from avian influenza is high enough that I think we are increasingly concerned about the population level impact it's having on the species. It turns out there's not as many snowy owls as we once thought. 20 years ago, the assumption was there were somewhere around 300,000 snowy owls worldwide. They're found in the entire circumpolar area in the northern hemisphere. And that estimate was based on some back of the envelope calculations, just adding up the maximum number of snowy owls nesting in up at Utqiagvik, where Denver's working, in Alaska, in the Western Canadian Arctic, the Central Canadian Arctic, Eastern Canadian Arctic, Greenland, Arctic Scandinavia, Russia. Well, what we didn't understand, what scientists didn't realize, is that those snowy owls are incredibly nomadic. We've seen this with our tracking. Snowy owls, we've had snowy owls that have traveled like 4,000 miles from one summer to the next. They might be breeding in northern Quebec one year and in the Western Canadian Arctic the next year. So what was happening for a really long time is that scientists were double or triple or quadruple counting the number of snowy owls out there. And with more recent information, including tracking data, the current estimate is that there are somewhere between 14,000 and 28,000 snowy owls, adult snowy owls of breeding age worldwide. That's the total population.
Less than 10% of what we thought it was 20 years ago.
An order of magnitude fewer than we thought. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the population has dropped that much. It's just that we were overestimating it. But a paper that a number of us, Project Snowstorm and our partners in the International Snowy Owl Working Group, published last year, looking at this kind of the first global status assessment for snowy owls, we found about a 30% decrease in the last 3 generations of snowy owls. So the population is going down, and it was not that high to start with. So when you add on to that,
that's separate from the fact that we'd overestimated the number.
So
even adjusting to a correct number or close, we still lost a third.
Exactly. That's the estimate. So every little bit counts with a species that's not only this relatively rare, but also kind of right in the crosshairs on climate change. I mean, they nest at the northernmost extent of land in the northern hemisphere. As the climate gets warmer, they can't go any farther north. So,
we've had this happen a number of times now. My next card, impact of climate change.
So there you go.
So I do want you to answer that, but first of all, with rodenticide, let's back up for 1 second and then we'll go back global. What are we doing, or what can we do to reduce that impact on raptors and everything else? People do want to kill rats, restaurants.
They do.
Breweries and stuff. So what do we do?
So there's a bunch of things we can do. Part of it is human behavior change. We can not leave as much trash around in our cities.
I'm sorry, you want us to get involved and try?
Oh, I know. This is a terrible thing.
Is there anything we can do that doesn't cost me money, time, or effort?
The short answer to that is no. That said, there are rodent control methods that are not as dangerous. There are actual birth control methods. For example, there are products out there that are based on.
You're not suggesting they're little rat condoms.
I'm not talking about little rat condoms. No, sir. But it's interesting that's where your mind went immediately.
On a rat. I'm willing to pitch in here, but
no, you don't have to do that either.
Okay.
No, there's material there. For example, there's something called Contrapest, which is based on cottonseed oil. It's a liquid bait, and it sterilizes both the male and female rodents. And it'll sterilize people. There have been cases where people have mistakenly used cottonseed oil for cooking and ended up sterile. But it's not a secondary poison. If a raptor or some other animal, because by the way, rodenticides are bad for dogs, they're bad for cats, they're bad for kids. There've been cases where kids have gotten into the stuff and died. These new really potent anticoagulants are really only supposed to be used by professional exterminators, although that's unfortunately not always the case. So there are other ways to approach this, and there's a lot of research going on that right now. And more states are looking, more and more communities and municipalities are looking at restricting the use of anticoagulants. The state of Massachusetts right now, their pesticide review board is looking at potentially dramatically tightening. We're hoping they'll dramatically tighten the use of anticoagulant rodenticides. But all of these pressures on snowy owls, whether we're talking about vehicle collisions and planes and high-path avian influenza and rodenticide, they're having an impact, we think, on these birds. It's a little hard to say because they breed in the most remote parts of the world, and it's not like there's a ton of people running around remote parts of the Arctic censusing snowy owls. We have to infer a little bit from the numbers of them that come south on these invasions. But I think it's fair to say most of us that work with snowy owls are worried.
Well, that is unfortunate. And as we talked about earlier in our conversation, snowy owls are a great face for some of these problems. So it's a terrible thing that it's snowy owls, but maybe that's the bird that's popular enough that it will generate some attention and some focus and some answers.
And that's what we've been trying to do for a long time with Project Snowstorm is use them as a surrogate. I always tell people, you're not going to see a polar bear walking down the street in your neighborhood, but in a big flight year, this little piece of the Arctic in the form of a snowy owl may show up, at your local shoreline or nearby farmland or national wildlife.
Well, let me throw this out here, by the way, just as an aside. I owned a marketing company for 35 years. This is what I did. If your project needs some help, I am happy to pitch in on a marketing and strategic level.
Well, let's talk.
Yeah, if there's value to that, I'm there.
Yep.
I would love to help.
So if folks are interested, it's www.projectsnowstorm.org, and maybe you can put that in the show notes.
I will. I'll put it up here. It'll be on the screen right now as you're talking.
Okay. All of the tracking data from all of the snowy owls that we have tracked over the years are available in online interactive maps. You can sign up for our blog updates. I do more or less weekly updates through the winter season from about December until April or May when the last owls go north. Because what we do is funded entirely by the public, everything we do is transparent and publicly available.
Well, that address will be up here on the screen as you're talking. And hopefully people will want to get involved. And if you need my help at another level, let me know what that is.
Super. Take you up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. So let me throw this out to you. You were kind enough to send me a note this morning to say, Scott, I don't know how political the show gets. And, you didn't want to cross the line. And I appreciate that heads up. And let me share my response to that, by the way. And for the listeners, the audience as well, I purposely keep the show non-political. It is not that I'm afraid of politics. I had a syndicated political column for 10 years. I had 2 radio shows that were political based. I've been down that route and I've done that. As a matter of fact, we share a story. You were talking about how you got that first gig where your friend said, hey, quit whining, get out there and do something. I used to have breakfast once a month with the editor of our county paper. We have about 800,000 people in the county I lived in. And we would talk about politics, and I would bellyache a little bit. And he said, why don't you quit bellyaching me and write a column for the newspaper? And I remember I wrote my first column, which I knew was brilliant. I assumed the Pulitzer people would be calling just based on the introductory column. And instead I got a call from the editor saying, excuse my French. He goes, I don't know what you think these 700 words are, but I can get this from any asshole on a bar stool. If you want to write something of value, then send it to me. So I did, and they bought it, and it wound up, running all over the country, and it was awesome. So I've been down that road. That's not what this show is about. However, that being said, you have a specific area, bird banding lab and breeding bird survey that you think our audience might be able to help out with.
Right. So as folks may understand, we have seen some really, in my opinion, devastating losses at the federal level in terms of wildlife conservation and science. And we can debate the value of the size of the federal budget. But one of the most critical aspects of bird conservation science in this country is what's known as the Ecosystems Missions Area at the U.S. Geological Survey. They're based at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center outside of Washington and Laurel, Maryland. And it includes, as you mentioned, the bird banding lab. All of the hands-on bird research in the U.S. happens through the authorization of the bird banding lab. Not just the bird bands, but all the tracking and telemetry and all this cool tech that we've been talking about.
So they're the hub.
Right. That's also where the breeding bird survey has been happening since 1966, this incredible volunteer-driven effort to tally birds across much of North America every year. Thousands and thousands of people heading out there and doing point counts. A lot of what we know about the population changes in North American birds over the last 50 years, 60 years, has come through the breeding bird survey. It costs almost nothing because the vast majority of the work is done by volunteers. The ecosystem missions area is also where you find 63 U.S. Geological Survey science centers scattered across the country, the Bee Lab, the Bat Lab, places that, really the only federal work that's being done, for example, to figure out how to prevent bats from dying from white nose syndrome. There are 44 cooperative fish and wildlife units at universities and colleges across the country that are the training ground for our next generations of wildlife biologists. All of these areas are at threat. The administration's budget zeroes out the ecosystem mission area. It zeroes out the bird banding lab, it zeroes out the breeding bird survey, it zeroes out the science center and the co-op units, all of that stuff. It doesn't, just because the administration poses that as a potential budget doesn't mean Congress needs to go along with it. And this is where your listeners can come in, in a strong way. As I understand it, and I'm, by the time people listen to this, it might be a little bit out of date, but the House appropriations bills that are considering this would maintain most of the funding from prior years. It'd be about a 5 or 6% decrease. The appropriations bill in the Senate would actually slightly increase the funding for the ecosystems mission area. This is as critical as bird conservation gets in the U.S. And so what I would urge people to do is get in touch with their U.S. representative, their congressperson, as well as both of their U.S. senators, and particularly if you're a Republican and if they are Republicans, and urge them to support full funding for the U.S. Geological Survey's ecosystem mission area. If you're a hunter, what happens at the bird banding lab is absolutely critical, especially if you're a duck hunter. I've hunted all my life. North America manages its waterfowl populations as well as it does. And by the way, this is in cooperation with Canada, and what happens to the U.S. bird banding lab has impacts for Canada because the U.S. bird banding lab supplies the bands and manages the database for the Canadian Wildlife Service and all the banding they do up there. So this is international. But we manage our duck populations, our waterfowl populations, really, really well because we survey them during the breeding season. We band something like several 100,000 ducks and geese every year. And hunters are terrific about returning the bands, the information from the bands that they get, so that we can see, what percentage are being killed, the demographics of those. All of those are critical pieces for managing waterfowl populations. And as we discussed earlier, waterfowl management is one of the shining examples of conservation success in the last 50 years. We don't want to lose that. We're talking about a fraction of a percent of the federal budget. Nobody at the ecosystems mission area, nobody at the bird banding lab is getting rich doing this. Almost all of the work that's being done by bird banders across the country doesn't cost the federal government a dime. If you want to talk about government efficiency, the banding lab is maybe the best example of that. For $1 million a year, there are about 1.5 million birds banded, critical to understanding what's happening with bird populations, where they're going, all the concrete things we've been talking about, the amazing marvels of migration. We know about that because we mark and follow wild birds. And if the banding lab goes away, I'm not sure what replaces it. That would be my plea for anybody watching this is put down the podcast, pick up the phone, call your senators, call your representative, tell them to support the bird banding lab and everything else at the ecosystem missions area at U.S. Geological Survey. And then I will get down off my soapbox.
Well, I got to put you back up, but just so we're clear, what Scott meant to say was finish the podcast. Right. Don't stop it now. We might have something interesting to say.
Okay, that's when you're done with the podcast. Good point.
Now, since we touched on something that would be considered slightly controversial, probably not very much so from the people who are watching this particular podcast, let's go to something that's completely non-political, which is the impact of climate change.
Oh, yes. That's
bird migration.
Nothing even remotely political or controversial about that. The fact is, the science is so settled on climate change that it really should not be controversial.
You would think.
You would think. There's absolutely no question that humanity is changing the climate and changing it dramatically. And I saw your question before, the impact of climate change on migratory birds. I think it's safe to say at this point that every moment of every migratory bird's annual cycle has been touched by climate change to some degree or other at this point. The question is, how fast is it changing? and how quickly can birds adapt to those changes. Yes, the climate has changed in the geologic past, but never at the pace that it's occurring now, and it's happening thousands of times faster. And yet birds have shown, in many respects, a significant amount of resiliency. We've seen some really frightening changes. Pied flycatchers in Europe experienced, massive population declines from the late 80s through the early 2000s because their migration timing had fallen so badly out of sync with the seasons. Spring's coming earlier and earlier and earlier. And these pied flycatchers flying back from tropical Africa to the forests of Central Europe were arriving pretty much on their historical, traditional timetable. And by the time they migrated back, set up a territory, found a mate, built a nest, laid eggs, incubated those eggs, hatched those chicks, and the chicks reached their hungriest, the insect peak in the forests of Central Europe, the seasonal peak had passed.
And in addition to the peak having passed, there are fewer and fewer insects every year, regardless of when the peak is, right?
The insect apocalypse, exactly.
I mean,
there are fewer and fewer insects.
We're the same age. When we grew up and you would drive from point A to point B, you would have to clean your windshield when you got to point B because you were always smashing insects on the way. And it's a simple thing, but you don't do that anymore.
Right. So here's the thing about
the insect apocalypse.
Yes. Yep.
That's not a great phrase.
Well, that's what the entomologists are using, the insect apocalypse.
Although it would make a great movie name.
So just to cycle back on the pied flycatchers, though, what was happening was during the critical period of like late April, last 2 weeks of April, first 2 weeks of May, from the 80s to the 2000s, the climate change accelerated during that period. It became rapidly warmer and spring advanced dramatically, and the birds just couldn't keep up. But what happened, and I want to stress here, this is not because climate change stopped, but starting around 2000, that period of rapid warming in early spring paused in Central Europe. And no one's really quite sure why, and it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to stay that way, but it paused long enough that the birds were able to catch up. Christian Both, who's a scientist in the Netherlands who's been studying these birds for years, was telling me for an article I did for Audubon a couple of years ago that the birds rapidly evolved an earlier arrival time, which kind of makes sense. The ones that were arriving later were not passing those genes on to a new generation. And the birds caught up, and their population has largely recovered. I think we underestimate the resiliency of birds at our peril, in part because there's kind of a doomerism right now that, it's like, why even bother to try? Because things are so bad. It's kind of hopeless. It's kind of pointless. But as we talked earlier, there were times in the 60s and 70s with raptor conservation when it seemed pointless and hopeless as well. And we brought those birds back. I am convinced that if we give birds half a chance, they will surprise us with their adaptability and their resiliency. But we got to give them half a chance.
Isn't there, and again, this is my marketing gene, right? This is my filter. But you mentioned somebody earlier in the podcast, a shorebird expert who wanted to talk about a success that they had. Isn't there something to be said for more of that? Yeah. Because I think at some point we just become deaf to it. If there's absolutely nothing we can do, the world's going to hell in a handbasket and we're all doomed in 8 years anyway, I'm just going to keep eating burgers, jack up my carbon footprint, and forget about it. But if you get a couple of success stories, that's what we don't want to get, we don't want to have rose-colored glasses on. We want to acknowledge the problem, but we have to give people hope.
Absolutely.
That if they do make adjustments or make demands of their senators, that something can be done. And
that's why I wrote the book that's coming out next year, because I think it's important for us. It's important for us to understand that we can make a difference. Scott, it was earlier this summer. I was out on Muscongas Bay. I teach every summer at the Hog Island Audubon camp up on the coast of Maine. Been doing that for 25 years. And during the adult field ornithology session that I was running, we had a camp of 14 to 17-year-old teen birders that were there for their field ornithology. And I got to spend part of the day out on a boat with them in Muscongas Bay. And when we talked about a lot of things while we were watching puffins and guillemots and eiders and bald eagle after bald eagle after bald eagle after. And the kids were, they're worried about climate change. They're not sure what kind of a world they're inheriting. We talked about how the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 90. And I said, look, when I was your age, I hated it when somebody my age said, when I was your age. here's the thing. When I was your age, there were no bald eagles. How many dozens of bald eagles have we seen out here today? I said, that would have seemed incomprehensible. So as you sit here right now, and yes, we've lost 2.9 billion birds in the last 50 years in North America and all the bad news you've been hearing, but we can turn that around. We have shown in the past that where there's a will, there's a way. The only thing it's only impossible if we don't try. And I said, I would really like to think that when you're my age, you'll be sitting here talking to a bunch of 14 and 17-year-olds and saying, look, you're not going to believe this, but in the 2020s, we thought we were going to lose birds. We thought we were going to lose migratory birds. And look around you now. Look at how we have restored the abundance of migratory birds because we've learned how to live on this planet. Yeah, okay, that sounds impossible, but it's only impossible if we know.
And people are trying. You mentioned earlier the rewilding projects, the Yellowstone to Yukon, trying to set up some of these corridors for terrestrial migration as well as flight. And it's from that point of view, it's an exciting time. And I think that if we can balance the type of information that we share so that we make people aware to the point where they want to act, but where they don't become depressed and then apathetic. And it's a delicate balance because I can only imagine for the people that are in it, that's what they do, the environmentalists and the biologists and the ecologists that are in that 8 or 10 hours a day and they're watching this devastation. You mentioned losing 30% of our birds in the last 50 years. You can lose sight of the fact that maybe a little optimism is of value.
Well, you could also argue that given everything that we've done to the planet, it's kind of remarkable that we've kept 2/3 of our birds in the last 50 years.
You know what, Scott? I agree with you 100%. I mean, in the last year, I've been blessed. The Serengeti, and then, as you probably know, the Yellowstone is often called America's Serengeti, and Monterey Bay is often called the Serengeti of the seas. And inside of the last 12 months, I've spent time at all three of those places. And I was brought to tears by the beauty and the number of animals and birds and, fauna and flora and everything. And I realized we have a shot. You can just pick up the paper every day and read it and say, shit, we're not going to make it anyway. So what do I care? But one page inside, you're starting to read about the projects and the people that are taking a step forward. Right. So we'll keep that going. All right. You had mentioned to me once before that when you die, there are 3 places that get your ashes. Hawk Mountain is one.
I might take a morbid turn here.
Well, as long as we're talking about climate change and whether we're going to make it or not, Hawk Mountain is one of those 3. And you've discussed that enough that people will recognize why. You brought up Hog Island, which is one of the other 2. Tell us what is so important to you about Hog Island that it gets 50 pounds of your ashes.
It's not going to be that much for me. So Hog Island is the oldest Audubon facility in the country. It was founded in 1936 on the coast of Maine. It's a 330-acre island on the mid-coast of Maine. And it was founded as a camp to teach teachers to teach nature. And 91 years later, excuse me, not quite. I'm sorry. I'm getting my places mixed up. Almost 90 years later, Hog Island is still doing that. I've been teaching there. This is my 20th season teaching at Hog Island. It's bird camp for grown-ups, basically. We get some kids up there. There's some family camps and some youth camps and teen camps, but it's mostly bird camp for adults. Last week, I was leading a fall migration session up there with my good friend Sarah Morris, who's the current president of the American Ornithological Society, which gives you an idea of the kind of talent that we attract. She's actually been teaching there since 1990. Holly Merker, whom I know you know, who's a very good friend and a terrific field trip leader.
Well, Holly's in the book and introduced me to 2 young teenagers that she met at Hog Island who were also in the book representing the upcoming generations of birders.
Fantastic. So it's a great place. And it is particularly important to me because I met my wife there in 2002. We got married there in 20 years ago last month in August of 2005. Thank you very much. I was fortunate enough to find a smart, wonderful, conservation-focused woman who has really bad judgment in men.
Did you have to start another banding operation in order to woo her?
Well, I'll tell you, our second date, she went hawk banding with me. and I caught her a goshawk. She got her life goshawk that day.
Okay, tell me that's not one of the great birds of anywhere in the world.
Heavens, yes. That's one of the great things about living here in New Hampshire is that goshawks are a yard bird for us.
When we were in Africa, it's a year ago this month, it was last September, I saw 3 new goshawks, 3 new species of goshawks. And I just, the dark chanting goshawk was, and it was on the ground, it was eating. And, our guy just wanted to roll through, and he's a checklister. And I said, no, you stop. You turn this dang Jeep off. I'm going to watch this bird for a little bit. And everybody else can just sit on their hands for all. I've looked at enough elephants and zebras in the last 2 weeks. We're watching this bird. And I got to watch this dark chanting goshawk, and I was just in love. So that's as good a reason as any for Hog Island. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So the last one, and let's be clear about this. This is a joke. We don't need to have Scott arrested tomorrow. Denali National Park.
Yep. Okay.
Where they frown on ashes being scattered. So
that's correct.
We'll do it surreptitiously.
So,
and I was just up there a couple of months ago, and it's a beautiful place. But what is this super attraction to you of all the places you've been in the world?
I've been traveling to Alaska since 1981. Denali, I don't know how many times at this point. The first trip I went to Alaska, we spent almost 3 weeks in the park with a couple of friends. One of them had a photographer's road permit, so we were actually able to drive a private car into the park. And so we had, remarkable access.
Those are unusual.
They are. They're few and far between, but he had one. This was 1981. So they had really just started the whole bus system up there. And I've been going back ever since. And I've been really fortunate over the years to have developed a partnership with my good friend Carol McIntyre, who's the park ornithologist up there. And we started something in 2013 called the Critical Connections Project, where we were studying the migratory movement of the birds that breed in Denali Park. Everybody, people hear about Denali, they think about wolves, they think about grizzly bears, and they think about a 20,000-foot tall mountain, all of which are fantastic. But there are hundreds of species of birds that breed in Denali and which fan out in many cases across 3/4 of the world's surface on their migrations. And even though Denali is 6 million acres, the park and preserve, that's not enough to protect those birds year round. You've got to look at the full annual life cycle of those birds. And if you're talking about gray-cheeked thrushes that winter in northern South America, or Swainson's thrushes that winter in southern South America and need landscapes, along that, in the case of the Swainson's thrush, 9,000-mile migration route. It's one of the longest migration routes of any North American songbird. If we don't know where they're going, we don't know what to protect. And so we started this project to figure out exactly where these birds are going. And the data was incredible. And I say was because, unfortunately, I think with the federal funding cuts, we were hoping our last field season was 2019 and the pandemic slowed us down. And as you're probably aware, the road that goes all the way back into the park partially collapsed. And so that,
and you can still only get, I think, 43 miles in.
Yeah. So our study site was way on the other side of that Pretty Rock Slump landslide. So we had been hoping next year to finally be able to restart the field work on that. We had a National Park Service grant. It was a competitive grant that was awarded to us, and that appears to have gone away. To veer back into the political side of things. Unfortunately, I think at this point, Critical Connections is probably not going to be coming back again. But what we found was remarkable. We did the first tracking of Arctic warblers, which are, as you're probably aware, an old world species that crosses the Bering Strait and breeds in central and western Alaska. Nobody had ever tracked those birds to their wintering grounds in Southeast Asia. And we got tracks from a couple of them, one of which went apparently to the island of Palau, which nobody had. And the other one went to the Philippines, which was expected. But the one in Palau was a bit of a shock because there are no records of Arctic warblers on Palau, but there's also not apparently a lot of birders on Palau. We also, we did a lot of tracking, as I said, of gray-cheeked and Swainson's thrushes. One of the gray-cheeked thrushes that we tracked, we were able to tag, recapture over the course of 5 migration seasons. So we got a tremendous amount of data from that bird. We also found this incredibly tight connection.
Sorry, can you hold on to that the next time you catch it? Because I need that as a lifer.
Well, I'll tell you, go to Denali and wander down in those willow thickets that's full of gray-cheeked thrushes during June, during the breeding season. Just be careful because there's also a lot of grizzly bears in those
Well, and
in
I'm
those thickets.
equally afraid of moose.
Well, I wouldn't say afraid. I am equally cautious around
Okay, well,
moose.
cautious is a polite word for scared.
Yes.
But yeah, I went in every morning by myself at about 4 a.m. and the park's completely empty. And so I got to be there with the moose at dawn.
Nice.
And I didn't get any grizzly in Denali. I got some in Jasper. We were at Jasper before that up in Canada. But anyway, I digress, and I'm sorry. Please continue.
Well, that's fine. No, that's fine. Well, I was just going to say that the Swainson's thrushes that we were tagging, this is kind of remarkable. We use GPS tags on Swainson's thrushes, which give you like a set number of really precise GPS points over the course of the year. And the battery should last about a year, so you get them on going south and coming back north again. And we had Swainson's thrushes that we tagged within a mile of each other in Denali National Park, within a mile or two of each other in Wrangell-St. Elias National Park, that flew 9,000 miles to the border between Bolivia and Argentina and wintered within about 20 kilometers of each other down there.
That's bar-tailed godwit.
It is.
9,000 miles.
Absolutely it is. And Swainson hawk, 9,000 miles from the Canadian prairies all the way down to the pampas of Argentina. So, I mean, amazing, amazing stuff from this project. If this really is the end of the Critical Connections project, it's going to be a shame because we were just kind of scratching the surface of what's going on in that park. Yeah, so that's Denali's the third leg of the tripod of where I'd love my ashes to go, legally or illegally.
Fair enough. Hopefully it's a long, long time before that happens.
Amen to that.
So I'm going to ask you one thing, and then we're going to close with a discussion about books.
Sure.
So we have talked before that you have a nemesis bird, a great gray owl.
Yep. Embarrassing to admit.
And that, yes. And by the way, that's a great thing. If I was running an ad campaign for this is what I would, Weidensaul can't find a great gray, and it would be a terrific thing. Now, you shared that with Chris Cooper.
Yep. Okay. We need to go on a great gray hunt.
Okay, so when I asked you this TV show that we're pitching, when I asked you if you would let me use your name for this Nemesis show, the idea was I'm going to bring Chris Cooper and Scott Weidensaul up to Sac-Sim. We're going to find great gray. Well, guess what Chris found 2 weeks ago in the Grand Tetons?
Oh, the bum.
I know. Now, and Chris has famously said, I'm a black gay man who refuses to go under 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm never going to see a great gray. But he found one in the middle of the summer in the Grand Tetons.
Oh, man. Well, good for him.
And 10 feet off the ground and 10 feet in front of him. And he got to watch it for a few minutes. Yeah. The good news is, should the show take off, should we get picked up, you will be the lone star. You won't have to share the spotlight with that damn Chris Cooper.
Well, except that I was really looking forward to being in the field with Chris. That would have been a lot of fun.
Well, you know what?
Also would have been fun to watch him shiver.
Yes. Well, or maybe we'll do it again where Chris is the leader. We go back to the Tetons and find one. And find out if he just made that up or if there really is a new one coming.
Now, I have to say, I have heard great gray owls at night. I just have yet to see one. I've heard them in Yellowstone. That very human-like, ooh.
Well,
ooh.
As you're saying that, there's a picture of one up on the screen from me in Yellowstone, minus 25 degrees by myself, 2 hours, 3 times it hunted. Nice. I saw it dive into the snow 3 times, twice successfully. And other than a time with a northern gray hawk, probably my most exciting bird find.
Very cool.
It was just extraordinary. Okay, so I did not ask you earlier, and I want to ask now. The Ghost with Trembling Wings, Search for Species That May or May Not Be Extinct. I was not familiar with that book until I started doing research for this conversation. Tell me about that, because that's the next book I'm ordering.
So it's one that I did in the early 2000s. I wanted to write about the extinction crisis in a way that was not completely depressing. So I came at it from the angle of the rediscovery of lost species. And because this happens from time to time.
Is this an ivory woodpecker kind of thing?
Exactly. It's just, for example, the Bermuda petrel, the cahau, was assumed to be extinct in 1630 and was rediscovered in the 1950s, a handful of pairs still breeding in Bermuda. coming and going under the cover of night, nesting underground, easy to overlook. And this happens more often than you would think. And we've always been drawn to that. Certainly I've always been drawn to that because I think we want the world to be bigger and more complete and more mysterious than perhaps sometimes we know it to be. So I was traveling all over the place. I was in St. Lucia looking for Semper's warbler, which was last seen in the 1960s, which is the ghost of the title. By the way, worst title ever for a book. There's a backstory there, but we don't need to get into it. But it was this ground nesting bird that was eventually wiped out by like mongooses and introduced predators. But when it was agitated, it would flutter its wings. It would tremble and flutter its wings. Went to, oh goodness, I was in Brazil, in Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil with my friend Doug Wexler from the Academy of Natural Sciences looking for the cone-billed tanager, which had been described from one specimen collected in 1938 and never seen again. And we spent weeks in the Cerrado grasslands and gallery forests of that part of Brazil along the Rio Juruena, trying to find the place where that one specimen was collected by a French physician in 1938. And we did not find it. And then about 2 years later, a Brazilian scientist found a population of them like 800 kilometers away. And you can book a trip and go see cone-billed tanagers. And my good friend John Kreischer has done that and loves to say, "Oh, Scott, have I shown you my picture of the cone-billed tanager? Here, let me show you that."
Let me put my great gray owl picture
exactly.
back.
Sticks a knife in and twists it. But wonderful to know that the bird still exists. It turns out it's not a tanager. It's probably more closely related to seed eaters. Yeah, it was a really fun experience. I will look forward to it.
Now, you've written and published 30-something books.
Mm-hmm.
And extraordinary success. We mentioned before, Pulitzer Prize finalist, New York Times bestseller. Which of the books that you've written and published is your most overlooked book?
That's a good question. Probably the one that's not about nature. I wrote one book. It's a straight history book. It's called The First Frontier, the forgotten story of struggle, savagery, and endurance in early America. It's about the Eastern colonial frontier from about 1500 until the end of the 7 Years' War. And if that seems like kind of a loopy subject for a naturalist to write about, I can tell you that a lot of professional historians said, "What is this damned ornithologist doing writing about history?" But I grew up in the area of the Eastern frontier. I mean, just over the mountain from where I lived was Bloody Spring Road that memorialized an attack during the 7 Years' War, French and Indian attack on an early Amish settlement. So it's just always been something I've been fascinated by. The coast of Maine, we mentioned Hog Island before. The first English expedition to the northern New England coast was in 1605 when George Weymouth sailed his ship, the Archangel, into the Georges Islands and ended up kidnapping a bunch of Wabanaki and taking them back to England to kind of pump them for information. One of them developed a taste for English beer, learned English, and when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, he walked up to them and in passable English asked if they had any beer. That was Samoset. So there's all of these stories and tales from that period of history that if I say frontier to most people, they immediately think Conestoga wagons, teepees, Plains Indian culture. But, the East was the frontier before that. And that period of time when Europe and indigenous America was learning and largely failing how to live with each other. And that was mostly Europe's fault.
And that has, well, there you go. I will look for that book. I did not know you'd written that, and I will look for that.
Yeah.
You have a new book coming out in the spring. Remind us the name of the book.
It's called The Return of the Oyster Catcher, Saving Birds to Save the Planet. And it'll be published in the U.S. by W.W. Norton, and it'll be published in the U.K. by Pan Macmillan Picador.
Okay, and that gets released when?
April 21st in the U.S., April 23rd in the U.K.
Okay, fantastic. You don't have a cover yet?
No, they're working on it right now. My editor sent me a whole bunch of oyster catcher pictures, and I had to point out to them that it was 3, possibly 4 different species of oyster catchers that their production department had found. American oyster catcher, American black oyster catcher, Eurasian oyster catcher, and possibly blackish oyster catcher, but I wasn't quite sure about that one. So we had to say, nah, you need to go back to the drawing board and just American oyster catchers along the Atlantic coast, please. It's fun. Working with non-birders sometimes can be a challenge.
It can be. All right. My last question for you,
Yep.
and first of all, thank you. You've been remarkably generous with your time
Oh,
today.
this has been fun. What are you talking about?
I've had a blast. When we took our break there in the middle, I went out and I told my wife, I said, "This has been so fun, and I get to do it again at 4 o'clock." Thank you.
Well, that's
Um,
great. This like the only podcast that's going to require an intermission so people can go to the
it
bathroom.
is. My son, who does a lot of the production, I called him and I said, "Just, you're going to have to split this up into a couple of shows because it's not going to fit into a single one." I'm throwing the email up now, my email. If you've got any questions on any of this, send me a note. I'll be happy to answer them. If you've got questions for Scott, I will forward them and we'll go forward from there. My last question for you, Scott, is I want to ask you to recommend a non-Weidensaul book to the audience, something nature related that you think they will enjoy, learn from, benefit from.
Well, a book, we were talking a little bit about history, and I've written a book about the history of birding and ornithology. But Ken Kaufman's book, The Birds That Audubon Missed, is just an absolute tour de force. Ken's never written history before that I'm aware of, and he knocked that one out of the park. I mean, again, this is a period of history, the first 30 or 40 years of the 19th century that I thought ornithologically I knew pretty well. And I think I could fairly say I learned something new on virtually every page of that book. It's beautifully written. It's meticulously researched. It's thought-provoking. Because he's dealing with people like John James Audubon, who are flawed, complicated people, and he doesn't pull any punches on that. In fact, pulls a whole lot fewer punches in his book than I did in mine. I never mentioned the fact that Audubon was a slaveholder. I mean, like, what was I thinking? And because Ken is also not just a really good writer, but an exceptionally talented artist, he was repainting many of the species of birds that Audubon missed, sort of in the style of Audubon, just to try to get in the head of Audubon as an artist. So The Birds That Audubon Missed by Ken Kaufman, it's a wonderful book. You will not regret reading it.
The cover's up there now as we're talking. So if you get a chance, order that. And just so you know, Ken's coming on as a guest. I think it's about a month from now he's scheduled. So
Right.
we'll get Ken on there. Of course, everyone will pale compared to the conversation Scott and I've had, but Ken will give it his best shot. And by the way, in between our two calls today, Scott, I got to have a conversation with Peter Kaesner.
Oh, super.
So we had a great conversation, and I told him I'd put a pause on ours and had the conversation with him.
You've been a busy boy today.
For me, it has been an extraordinary day. And to be really candid, and I've mentioned this before to the listeners, this is why I started this. This has given me access to such fascinating people. And I don't know how much time, if you've had a chance to watch some of the podcasts, but we've expanded beyond just the birding. I just scheduled a podcast with a gentleman who has spent his lifetime playing music with birds and whales, David Rothenberg.
Oh, yes, of course. Oh, yeah. He's marvelous work.
We scheduled something, and I'm going to have David on. But in doing my research and preparing for that, I sent him a note just today saying, we can't even discuss the birds. We'll use up all our time just discussing the whales. And if we both have a good time, we'll come back and do another one on birds. Because as I read his book, he sent me a book, and I read the book over the weekend. It's like, there's 2 or 3 shows just in this whale book. And that's the great part about talking to the people like you that I get to talk to, is so many things to learn and to enjoy. Following this, I'm going to do field notes as I always do. I hope you enjoy those, and or at least as much as I enjoy doing them. I want to say, Scott, sincerely from my heart, thank you so much for your generosity here.
Oh.
And as I say to every one of these things that I end up, man, stay safe and stay curious.
Yep. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure, Scott. Take care.
Hello, and welcome to the 19th edition of Field Notes. We're starting to rack up a few of these things, and they just seem to be getting more and more fun, at least for me, and I hope they are for you. And I certainly appreciate you listening. Today's a neat one for me. It's on Denali National Park. Denali is one of the 63 national parks in the United States National Park Service. And my wife and I have been to 54 with a life goal of getting to all 63. And by the way, when we started that, we've been married 46 years, there were only 49 national parks. As we get close, they just keep adding them. So they're at 63 right now. We've been to 54. We were at Denali this summer and had a terrific time. And I want to share some of our personal story and the story about the parks. Settle in, we'll talk for a couple of minutes. Denali is a massive park, 6 million acres. It's larger than the state of New Jersey. And of those 6 million acres, 1 million of them are covered by glaciers. Massive, massive amount of glaciers covering over 1 million acres. Denali Mountain, which has been named Denali Mountain since 2015. Before that, it was Mount McKinley. And the mountain is the same, just the name has changed. And we'll see how long Denali Mountain holds, but that is a Native American, Native Alaskan tribe name for the mountain. And whatever you want to call it, it is stunning. It is the highest peak in North America. The summit is over 20,000 feet. Those who go into the park, unfortunately, about 2/3 of them never get to see Denali. Lots of bad weather up there, cloud, fog, rain, snow. It's just rough weather. And so roughly 2/3 of the time, the summit or the peak of Mount Denali is not available. Now, it is freezing cold. People say freezing, 32 degrees is freezing. At the summit of Mount Denali, it can reach 100 degrees, minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Absolutely stone cold. I've never been anything more than minus 36. And even that was once. Minus 100 is remarkable. Now, as massive as the park is, it is not easy to get around in. There is only one road available to the public, Denali Park Road, and only the first 15 miles of that, heading up to the Savage River, are open to the public, where you can just take your car or you rent a car or whatever it is and go down that road. It's an out and back. You go down 15, you come back 15. Is it worth it? Percent. It is a stunning, stunning 15 miles. And we're going to talk about some of the wildlife you can see and, of course, the amazing landscapes. Now, the road itself is 92 miles long. And to go from mile 15 to mile 92, you've got to take a tour bus. And that you've got to sign up for pretty far in advance. They fill up because it's the only way. Now, my wife and I, like a lot of us, are not big tour bus people. You don't see us on a tour bus heading down, through Paris or Barcelona or something. I'm just not a fan of that. But this is worth it. It's comfortable. The driver is also a guide. They're good on information and they're good at spotting things. Frankly, you've got another 30 pairs of eyes looking for animals, and they're not always easy to see. And none of that matters because it's the only way you can do it. Unfortunately, since 2021, you can only go into mile 45. And that's what we did. There was a landslide, a rock slide in 2021. And not surprisingly, the work is taking a tremendous amount of time. You're out in the middle of nowhere. It's government run. There's a lot of things working against it. The winters, you got to shut down. But they're expecting to open it maybe as soon as next year or the year after. And I'm going to go back and take that out to mile 92. But going out to mile 15 in my own car, which I did every day for a week, Randy and I did, well, I went out sometimes like at 4 a.m, so Randy didn't go on those. But every day we hit that mile 15. And then we also took the tour out to mile 45, and it was well worth it. You can hike and camp in there with permits. Check the website. There are no trails. Just literally, you get on the bus, you go, you say, hey, stop here, you get off, and you start going. Denali National Park has what's called a Big Five. If you're not familiar with those, they're generally mammals. It started in Africa, where people say, oh, we're going to Africa to see the Big Five. And the Big Five traditionally in Africa have been the elephant, the lion, the leopard, the Cape buffalo, and the black rhino. I wonder how you have a Big Five and don't include things like a giraffe, a hippo, or a cheetah. I've been fortunate, Randy and I have been fortunate to have seen all 8 of those in Tanzania and in Kenya, and I'll throw some of the photos up. Amazing animals, but I would say there's 8. Now, as an old-time marketing guy, I respect marketing programs, and ecotourism has led to a new 5 in Africa that's called the Ugly 5, the hyena, the warthog, the marabou stork, the vulture, and the wildebeest. I understand that they're different looking than the way a platypus is different looking. I would not call them ugly. I loved watching them. But I will say my wife used the word ugly a couple times down there when talking about wildebeest. So who knows? Anyway, in Denali National Park, which has 39 mammals total, they have what they call their Big Five: the grizzly bears, the wolves, the moose, the caribou, and the Dall sheep. And I'm going to throw up pictures of moose and caribou and Dall sheep because those are what we saw on the trip. We did not get to see any wolves and not get to see any grizzly bears. I've been lucky enough to see wolves at Yellowstone National Park, and I've been lucky enough to see grizzly bears at Yellowstone National Park and Jasper National Park up in Canada, but did not see them at Denali. Would have Love to. And of course, that's what everybody's hoping for, right? Those are the top two, if you will, the grizzly bears and the wolves. But there is something about the moose and the caribou and the Dall sheep that are really neat. And one of the things that's fun, one of the reasons I would go into the park at 4 a.m, and by the way, it's light. Remember, you're so far north, and I was there in the summer. There are moose all over at 4 a.m, and there's no people. Nobody's getting up at 4 a.m and going through the park. So I would go through on the way into the park, I would see moose. And then in those first few miles, that's where the most moose are. Once you get past mile 15, you kind of lose the moose. But those first 15 miles, there's a lot of them. And you're looking at pictures of them now. And I saw them every day, and multiple ones every day. I saw mamas and babies. I saw them in ponds. I saw them walking on the road. I saw them in the hills, all over. Another couple of mammals, and pictures are going up now. I got to see a cross fox and a porcupine. The cross fox is one that if I'd been driving my own car, I probably wouldn't have seen, like the Dall sheep. Somebody else on the bus was able to spot that, and then the driver was able to get us on him. So that was a pretty neat deal. The other mammal in Denali National Park that is well worth seeing is the sled dogs. Denali is the only national park in the country that has working sled dogs, because there are places in the winter where the weather is so bad that it is safer to go out on with sled dogs than it is on snowmobiles or the big snow tracks or whatever it might be. And again, they're the only working sled dogs in the national park system. They are Alaskan Huskies, Alaskan Malamutes, and Siberian Huskies. They are gorgeous. When you're there in the summer, the dogs aren't working very much. They don't need them because of the lack of snow. So they have guests come in and they do little exhibits and stuff, and you get to watch the dogs pull a rolling sled, and you can go in pretty close to the dogs. They'll let you into the area. You can't pet the dogs, but you can come within about 5 feet of them, and that's pretty neat. For you birders out there, and I know a lot of you are, 169 bird species. You're looking now at a long-tailed jaeger, which was a lifer for me, one of my 3 lifers on the trip up there. I also got a Smith's longspur. Didn't get any pictures, unfortunately, but I did get a willow ptarmigan, and you're looking at a picture of that as we speak. Just as a reminder for those who keep track of Nemesis birds, minus still the white-tailed ptarmigan, another failed visit to Colorado to see that little sucker this summer. But I will get it. I will get it. 4 trips out to Colorado, I haven't got it yet. And this is spectacular. There is one amphibian, no reptiles, but one amphibian in Denali National Park. It is the wood frog. And if you're not familiar with the wood frog, man, you ought to be. The wood frog is frozen solid during the winter. Its heart stops. 2/3 of the water in its body turns to ice, and it is frozen solid. It is, what is the word, cryogenic? Man, that's it. And then it thaws out in the spring and it survives. And I didn't get to see any of those, but I would love to. And it's just amazing, as we continue to be amazed and surprised and even shocked by things that happen in nature. I think an animal that freezes for a few months, rock solid, literally like a rock, a piece of ice with no functioning body. The heart is completely stopped. That's a pretty cool thing right there. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you haven't yet subscribed, if you're watching us on YouTube, do me a favor and subscribe. Doesn't take any time, doesn't cost anything, and it sure helps us out. It helps get our videos out to more viewers, which helps us bring in more guests, which brings our message to more people about the beauty and the astounding things that happen in nature. And so we would really appreciate that. And as always, when you're outdoors, and I hope you're out there a lot, but when you're outdoors, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you for watching. Have an amazing day.